Welcome to the show. I am so excited to welcome back Dr. Deborah Budding, our neurodevelopmentally focused neuropsychologist. Hey, Deb, how are you?
Hey,
You're ticking.
I am salty about something.
Nothing's changed then. Hey,
It just depends on what I'm salty about on any given day.
That's right. We have to just choose the right topic, I guess. Which today is probably one of those topics because the reason why we're having this conversation is a pattern or a theme in our community that we have both been noticing that is gaining momentum. And to have a conversation about it because we've been getting questions about what this is. So the topic today that I'd love for us to unpack and, really have a dialogue about is pathological demand avoidance, or PDA. I'm going to define it based on Wikipedia, and I will put the link to the wiki page below. But according to Wikipedia, pathological demand avoidance is proposed as a subtype of autism spectrum disorder. Characteristics ascribed to the condition include greater refusal to do what is asked of the person, even to activities the person would normally like. It is not recognized by either the DSM-5 or the ICD-10 and is unlikely to be separated out now that the umbrella diagnosis of ASD has been adopted. I'm just going to read the next line here. In 2011, it was suggested that these symptoms could represent the condition oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD.
Another
favorite. Elizabeth O'Nions and others argue that unlike ASD, children with PDA or pathological demand avoidance are said to use socially manipulative avoidance strategies. And unlike ODD, they resort to extreme, embarrassing, or age-inappropriate behavior. So pathological demand avoidance as a term was proposed in 1980 by the UK child psychologist Elizabeth Ann Newson. I think it's important for us to define this because people are asking us what this is. They're seeing this term or this label more and more.
I've had people ask me for resources. Like I had somebody say, hey, what books do you recommend about pathological demand avoidance? And I said, none books. None. I recommend none books.
None books about it. Deb, what are your thoughts? I think the reason why there is a reflexive or protective reaction here is because, one, the definition, and if you read this definition, is pathologizing.
Yeah, it's right in the title.
Yeah.
So when people have asked me this in the past, I have said, listen, I come from a sensory motor development perspective, movement planning, motor planning. And for people listening who want more information about that, you can listen to Gwen's interview with Dana Johnson, who kind of goes more in depth into that approach. And also incorporating a cultural and an identity piece to neurodivergence. And that while aspects of autism spectrum disorder, which is it seems, while ADHD and some other neurodevelopmental differences do get lumped in sometimes when talking about pathological demand avoidance, more often than not, when people are asking about it, it's usually in relation to somebody who has been identified as autistic. And one of the things from a sensory motor perspective that we know about people on the autism spectrum is that motor planning issues and making and following through on intentions are part and parcel of that neurotype. And So from my perspective, there's nothing inherently pathological about avoiding or refusing a demand that either is something difficult for you to do, or you simply don't want to do it, and you're not allowed the autonomy or the independence to refuse. And then we get into the world of coercion. And I'm not, we can talk about ABA another day. But it all kind of fits together within this this overlapping set of ideas about autistic people, where there's something manipulative. I mean, I remember having conversations years ago with people about meltdowns, and they would refer to them as tantrums and as manipulative, right? This person is having a tantrum because all I asked them to do was stop doing one thing and do another thing instead, right? Without any understanding of sensory sensitivities, propensity to meltdown, anything that's based more on neurological and physiological reasons, as opposed to sort of inherent manipulative, cognitively driven attempts to drive the caregiver or person providing services crazy, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a family I worked with recently, actually, very, very recently, where the parents were saying, well, and the kid has PDA. And I'm like, public displays of affection. I'm not necessarily against that. Oh, the other PDA, the one I don't like. And spent a good amount of time educating them about some of the behaviors that they were describing as pathological demand avoidance, that almost always had to do with asking or telling this kid to do something after they've had a very long day of managing the demands of school, both academic and social, we're tired, and then unload the dishwasher. No. So I think, as we both find, that neurodivergent people are already in a position of being misinterpreted by other people, especially by kind of holistic folks. And so just labeling something pathological doesn't get us any closer to understanding who the person is and the motivations they may or may not have about what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with oppositional defiant disorder, which is a neurologist colleague of ours. When I told him that we were planning on doing this discussion of PDA, said, don't forget to talk about how oppositional defiant disorder is terrible and shouldn't be used. I said, I gotcha. Yeah. But all of these sort of fall within, I find, to be a very denigrating way of thinking about people who have disabilities. And it's sort of like a wheelchair user I know, like, can walk, but has a hard time walking, and conserves energy better by using a wheelchair, so that sometimes when they need to walk, there's more energy to do so. And have people say to them, like when they catch them, walking, aha, do you really need that wheelchair, or are you just using it to manipulate, right? Yeah. So I'm not saying that people cannot be manipulative, but I will say, of the people I have met in my life who have been manipulative, none of them have been autistic. So I think that that in order to sort of, I think, come up against people increasingly using this term, we need to find something to give them to use instead when talking about people. Because terms like this, I feel, get put into use because it's an easy shorthand when the reality is often much more complicated, right? And many of the cases that you and I see are with people who have multiple disabilities, multiple diagnoses, some of them medical, and a great amount of complexity. And I think there's a lot of times a desire, and an understandable desire, to make things simpler. But I'm not okay with making things simpler to the extent that they are just fundamentally erasing to the person that we're supposedly helping.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of people trying to help autistic people who come at it from a perspective that I do not find, I don't know, respectful seems not the right word, but just very dehumanizing, basically.
Yeah.
And I view it as a dehumanizing designation at root.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a movement, like, can we move away from pathologizing? You know,
Right.
that in and of itself is a problem, right? Because if the framework is already coming from pathology, manipulation, okay, how in the world
Right.
then do we as support people, allies, families, teachers, speech, whoever we are, how do we then infuse compassion and understanding
Right.
to truly meet the person where they are? And maybe that's just my bias as a psychologist, but I find that when I approach my client or their family or the support system, that could be an IEP team, an IPP team, it doesn't matter. And I approach it where I say, there's something wrong with this person. We don't get off. I mean, we're not going to get off on the right foot.
No.
You know,
Right.
the other thing too, Deb, kind of going back to sensory motor, the importance of sensory motor, how you can't disconnect sensory and motor, and how sensory motor is innately, reflexively part of who we are.
Exactly.
And whenever we talk about sensory motor, I think my mind always goes to intention. Because if you don't have a deeper context and compassion for what's happening inside of a person, then the way that we would ascribe their intentions tends to be off. And it doesn't tend to be positive.
Well, it's part of that double empathy problem, right? I don't know how often attempts have been made to really delve into whatever is supposedly being pathologically refused, you know, that whatever that the demand is that is being avoided gets discussed in terms of, right, okay, so you say no. And you know, one of the things we joke about with some of the younger kids I see, you know, who are on the spectrum is, you know, we kind of jokingly refer to them as Dr. No. And because any new thing is a no, I'm not going to do it. And part of that reflexive no, I think, stems from, I have limited energy and resources, and here is something new. And I'm just thinking about doing this new thing, I'm already in fight flight. So the other thing I think we have to keep in mind in terms of avoidance or resistance or whatever has to do with fight flight mechanisms and arousal mechanisms, and how and I think many mental health people are trained to focus on feelings. And sometimes your body just does what it does, regardless of what your feelings are. And that is a hard pill to swallow, I think, for a number of folks. And so it's sort of that instead of trying to pathologize a behavior, right, that is one that you view as demand avoidant. And again, people themselves, have said, hey, I'm, why am I avoiding doing X, Y, or Z? This must be pathological. So this is a way people sometimes think about themselves. Although I think that's a breakdown product of being raised in an environment where you are judged for things that you cannot do easily. You do not get a designation or diagnosis of autism or ADHD or any other sort of neurodevelopmental difference without having trouble doing things. So it's sort of assumed within that designation that you're going to have some trouble doing things. That's sort of the point.
That's sort of the point. So I think the encouragement here is, okay, we know what pathological demand avoidance is on paper, right? We know that it's right.
I mean, do we look, I was trained as a poet initially, right? So I'm like, there's a lot more words here than we need to have.
Yeah.
I think we just need less words.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of unneeded repetition.
Yeah. Yeah. And for us, it's about encouraging a more accurate, compassionate look at what's happening for a person. So it's
the
not
compassion part that's super missing here.
Yeah.
That there's the idea that this is, when you use the word manipulative, that indicates purposeful behavior for ulterior motives. I mean, I don't know of any circumstance where I've heard somebody use the term manipulative as a compliment, unless I'm watching some gang movie or something, or mafia movie. It's like, ooh, great manipulation there, but that's awesome. But for the most part, when we hear the term manipulative, it's usually meant as a pejorative. And it's not that people can, again, I view, because I've been doing work in a lot of settings for a long time, and I can think of some residential placements, with kids who had some pretty severe regulatory challenges, engaging in behaviors that were labeled manipulative, but they were always to avoid doing something that would cause them either emotional or physical pain.
Mm-hmm.
It was always an escape attempt to get away from something that would trigger a fight-flight response.
Mm-hmm. Which happens in a millisecond. That happens in a millisecond. Those fight, flight, freeze, now we know fib, fawn, it's been added, right?
Right.
Those stress responses are millisecond. I mean, they are microseconds. Like, they happen so quickly before we cognitively even put a label on it.
Yeah.
That, the other thing that I thought about too, and whenever I hear manipulation or when someone says, oh, they're manipulative, my next question to a person is like, how good is this person's executive functioning skills? Right. And they tend to be like, oh, terrible. And I'm like,
right.
So to manipulate, we actually do need like a goal, for the plan, and then we need to set the plan, and then we need to follow the plan in order to manipulate the person, right? So how can those two things be in existence? And
That's
I think
exactly right.
Right? Like, I think exactly for you and I, it's like, how do we move away from pathologizing or reducing someone to a pathology, to something that's wrong with them, and then we plan their treatment or their supports around that concept, that framework.
Right.
That, I think you and I, who have worked with lots of different clients, when we actually get back into the neurological system,
Right.
we have a different kind of compassion for that person that tends to be gentle, meets them where they are, reinforces success, and gives voice
Right.
to what
Well,
they want.
and also, and again, I think that the challenging thing for outside people to understand when they're, because a lot of times they'll say, well, but for a pathologically avoidant person, they're avoiding doing a thing they want to do, right? Well, you and I know plenty of people who want to do things, yet often cannot, due to a combination of motor planning, sensory sensitivities, automaticity difficulties, and if you're just looking at things through this kind of corticocentric lens of, I wish with my big giant frontal cortex that exists to rule over everything else, I wish to do this thing, and therefore I shall do it. And especially when it's, my parent, teacher, therapist, whatever, tells me to do something. Oh, then I better step up and do it, whether I want to or not.
Mm-hmm.
And a big part of difficulty, I think, is managing bodily autonomy and how to navigate not being turned into a compliant person who is then vulnerable for abuse down the road because you've been trained out of being able to say no.
And question authority, right? Respectfully and reasonably, but question authority,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? Deb, when we talk about this, my mind from a philosophical standpoint goes to, do we truly have free will? Right? Like,
well, we know somebody who would say no.
so, I think the main purpose of our conversation today is really, how do we define this term, this label? How do we maybe highlight some of its harms, how it can harm people? And our encouragement to anyone who's listening to, if you find yourself using this label or term, to step back and say, do I really know do I really know this person? Have I looked at their sensory motor systems, their brain body connection, how overwhelmed they might be or not? But just even going back to the basics of that, our encouragement would be to go back there and just to take a look at that again.
Well, because also, when I get a report of when I see somebody who's been seen previously by other people, which is most of the time, whenever the report front and center, primary diagnosis, oppositional defiant disorder, my first thought is, you didn't like this person. That is my first thought. I never use that diagnosis ever. I can say somebody is experienced by others as oppositional, can engage in behaviors that are seen as defiant. But to me, to use that diagnosis is a sign of incredible laziness, because usually what that means is there's some other neurodevelopmental thing going on that has not been understood or supported sufficiently.
Yeah.
But I also have found that there are way more people doing work with vulnerable populations who really don't seem to like them very much. And I'm like, there's a whole world of other careers you could pick. Go pick one of those. And if you want to work with vulnerable populations, then you have to start from a more compassionate place and from a desire to understand. There's, it's like the person, again, the example that people use a lot of times about why, ABA and or shock therapy is important is to reduce self-harm behaviors. And I'm like, well, what if you stopped and thought about what is it that's causing so much pain that hitting your head on the floor is less painful than whatever that is, or serves as a distraction to whatever that is, instead of trying to train them to stop paying attention to it. So there has to be, I think, a fundamental understanding that the person you're working with who is pathologically avoidant or whatever probably exists on a completely different planet than you do, and so speaks a different language, has a fundamentally different understanding of things. And so you can label it whatever you want if that makes you feel better, but if you're actually interested in helping this person to feel more comfortable and more capable, then you have to learn to speak their language. And I understand that it's a lot more effort to do that than to just, try to train them to do what you say. But then the question is, who is this for?
Yeah. Yeah. And that, are you in a position yourself to challenge your own fundamental belief systems about how you understand someone else?
Well, it's the idea of free will again, right? I mean, I was being sort of flippant about that because of reasons, but I do think that, of course we all have choices, right? And I kind of separate free will and being able to make choices into different things, because we operate within structures that are larger than us. And that, if we're being real, there aren't many of us as individuals who have the power to change structures. Groups can change structures, time can change structures, just not that structures can never be changed, but the power any individual has comes under some amount of limitation. And so one of the reasons being more compassionate toward other people while having boundaries and not allowing oneself to be abused is doing our best to influence the environment as we can in a way that is experienced as helpful as much as possible. And sometimes if somebody's in a swivet for whatever reason, you're helping to try to calm that system down in that moment may not be experienced as particularly helpful, but right. So there's judgment calls to be made. But I still think the trying to, as much as possible, come from a do no harm perspective. We're all going to misunderstand things. We're all going to make mistakes. But I guarantee you, if you're starting out from a position where you're calling the person you're dealing with, in a pathologizing way, and you're using pathological demand avoidance, is, again, when I've had this conversation with other professionals, I'm like, what are you trying to make my job harder? Yeah. My job is hard already, not by the fault of the people I'm working with, but just the difficulty of being, constantly trying to learn lots of different languages, and so having to undo the damage of, constant pathologizing is really difficult. And that, that's one of the reasons why I've been sort of buying extra copies of Nick Walker's Neuroqueer Heresies and just handing it to parents. Just saying, just read this.
She gives a wonderful framework for how to use.
And it's very clear.
It's
Very
very
clear.
clear. It's an awesome book, and maybe that can be something that you and I have another episode on, where we can talk about, how we came to the book and how we understand.
Yeah. And the process of neuroquerying, is a very that, and also Sincerely Your Autistic Child, I think, are probably two books that I tend to most frequently these days recommend to people, because there's been this expertise bias where we've given a tremendous amount of power and authority to people who really don't have any actual lived experience of being neurodivergent, which is one of the reasons why I refer to myself now as neurodivergent, because I may not be autistic, dang it, but I have ADHD. I am not neurotypical, and so when I say that ADHD book you're reading is crap and the recommendations are crap, I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, it's written by somebody who only has the book learning about what it means to be neurodivergent. And again, it's not that I think it's impossible to do good work if you're neurotypical, but I do think that the reflexive authority that we often give to people is problematic, and it ends up harming people. And the folks over at Thinking People's Guide to Autism talk about that a lot, and write about it a lot, and have ideas about a more truly intersectional approach, right? That there are many people who are neurodivergent, and that's just one of their intersections of being minoritized. And so what about some of this, supposed pathologically avoidant behavior also stems from being tired of being ignored along multiple intersections, and even within, there's issues even within the sort of neurodiversity oriented communities. There's issues along race and gender and sexuality, and these are complicated issues. And so for me, adding layers of pathologizing language on top of it doesn't help us get anywhere productive.
Yeah. Which I think with the heart of the matter is understanding.
Yeah.
That and something that I find is very helpful is when you seek to understand and you put words to it. So how many of our clients have then had the language to be compassionate with themselves? Right. Which has been an incredibly powerful transformational process for them because of the way of the information and the meta communication that they've received,
right?
For most of their life by very well-intentioned systems and people.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too, that I do understand that people using this terminology and these diagnoses frequently don't have, malintent with it.
Yeah.
Usually.
Yeah.
Usually. But there is that point where your intent doesn't matter as much as the outcome. And so while I appreciate and welcome good intent, I also think you could just not use the term.
Yeah, and I think that's our encouragement here is, if you see this term, you hear this term, take a pause. And just
and especially if you're going to apply it to yourself, right? Because I do find that growing up as a neurodivergent person in a typical household where differences are not understood or respected, it is really common to have this sort of underlying self-hatred start fomenting. And it's so much work to undo that.
Yeah.
And I just remember I think it was from Academy. I was doing an interview with Nick Walker, and she was being really funny about something, and talked about, on the one hand, can't help it, was born this way, but on the other hand, you know what? I do what I want, and I'm just going to get weirder. And I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
So, and I do think when people who have been marginalized and in a one-down position decide not going to do that anymore, can make other people very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, another area for us to talk about is just culturally. It's just the cultural zeitgeist. And again, like it's a whole, but for us, we understand this is complex. I mean, that's why we're having these conversations.
Right.
And our encouragement really is to insert or infuse more compassion and understanding, to understand.
But also some humor, right?
Like, yeah, for sure.
Like, where's the humor in pathological demand avoidance, right? Like, I don't know how am I going to make that funny?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, hey, thanks for always humoring me and coming on and having these conversations. And
I'm so glad that you have the energy to do this, because again, I periodically people say, "Oh, hey, you're going to do your podcast again?" I'm like, nah.
No, you'll just come on here and we'll have our conversations. That's what we'll do.
I'll just visit other people and I'll let you deal with the technical stuff.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Deb.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.